Hello there, my name's Steve, I'm a teacher and I make videos about coding, computer science, graphics and other stuff for students and anyone else who's interested. Now today I'm going to show you how to use JavaScript to make a page scroll when you click on a link. Let's get on with it. Now before I get into how to do this with JavaScript, let's start by looking at how we can get page scrolling to work using just HTML and CSS. Now to demonstrate this, I'm going to edit AMD's website using the inspector. So first of all, I'm going to move down the page to a point that I'd like to scroll to. So let's use this div here. I'm going to right click and inspect. And I'm looking to see if that div has got an ID attribute within the HTML, and I can see that it does. So I'm going to copy that, close the inspector. Now I'm going to go up to the address bar, and on the end of the URL I'm going to put hashtag and then the ID. And when I hit return, you'll see that this URL actually takes me directly to that part of the page. So that's the first thing that we need to understand, that a hyperlink can actually link directly to an element with a particular ID. But obviously it's not scrolling at the moment, so let's carry on editing. I'm going to go back to the top of the page. I'm going to edit this website so that when you click on the logo, it scrolls down to that point on the page. Let me right click and inspect. Now we can see at the moment that the logo actually has an anchor tag wrapped around it. So this is already a hyperlink, and at the moment it's just going to the home page. So let me edit that attribute, and just like I did a minute ago, I'm going to put hashtag and then the ID. Let's try this out. There we go. So that's fully working, but it's still not scrolling. So in order to create that scrolling effect, I actually need to edit a different part of the page. I'm going to go all the way up to the actual HTML element itself. And I'm going to add on a new style, which is the scroll behavior. And the one that I'm looking for is smooth. Let's close the inspector. Let me go ahead and click the logo, and you'll see that it now scrolls down to that part of the page. Now let's open up the Game Life project from my last video and have a go at implementing this scrolling method using just HTML and CSS. So here I am in Replit. I've got my code on the left and my preview on the right. Before we start, I should just remind you that the website we created in my last video was just a demo project. So although up here I've got Steam and PlayStation, Xbox, etc., the content of my actual site doesn't relate to those icons at all. But for the purposes of this video, I'm going to assume that this area here is going to be a Steam section, and then this can be PlayStation, this will be Xbox, and then the mobile icon will link to the section with the map. So the first thing we need to do, of course, is go into our HTML and actually put an ID onto each of these different elements. So let's start with the main part of the site. Here it is. ID. And this one, remember, was Steam. On to the next one. PlayStation, Xbox, and mobile. And now all we need to do is actually go up to those icons in our navigation, which are here, and drop an anchor tag around each of the I tags so that it becomes a hyperlink. So there's the opening anchor. Let's go to the other side of the I tag. And there's the closing part of the tag. Back into the opening tag, put in an href attribute, and this, remember, is where you put the URL of where you want the anchor tag to hyperlink to. And if I want it to hyperlink to an ID on the page, all I need to do is put a hashtag and then the ID of the element I want it to link to. So let me go ahead and fast forward while I do the other three. Okay, so all my hyperlinks are in place. Let me just shrink the screen back again and refresh. So the first thing you've probably noticed is that the icons have now turned blue, and we will fix that. But the reason they've turned blue, of course, is because we've just put anchor tags around them, and anchor tags by default are blue. But let me go ahead and click on these and actually show you that it works. So you can see that each of these icons is now linking to the relevant part of the page. So now let's go into the CSS and add in the scroll behavior. So right up into the top of my CSS, HTML, scroll behavior, smooth. Let's refresh the page again. And now you'll see that it smoothly scrolls to the different sections. But you might have spotted another problem here, which is that in this particular project, we've got a fixed header. And when you make an element fixed, it essentially lifts it off the page. And that means that as we're navigating around to these different sections, they're scrolling to the top of the page, but that's hidden behind our fixed header. Now, unfortunately, using this method of scrolling using just HTML and CSS, this isn't easily fixed. So we've got a couple of options. One would be to simply make our header no longer fixed, so that it's just at the top of the page, and when you scroll down, it goes off the page, and that would solve the problem. But of course, if you've designed your site to have a fixed header, you shouldn't be compromising on that just to get the page to scroll. So the other workaround would be to add a hidden element slightly above the section that you're actually linking to and give that the ID instead. But that's a little bit clunky, and to be honest, if you're having this problem, then really you need to be looking at a JavaScript solution instead. Okay, so before we go on to look at JavaScript, let's just quickly fix the problem that we've now got with those anchor tags. And all we need to do is go down in our CSS and find the part where we're actually applying the color to the list items, which is around here, and change this so that it's the anchor tags that we're coloring instead. So first of all, let me actually style the anchor tags within those list items, because I want their default color, which has been changed to blue, remember, to just go back to being black. And here, where we've currently got list item hover, I'm going to change this so that it's the anchor tags inside those list items which are being hovered over. Let's refresh the page. And now you can see that we're back to black icons that change color when they're hovered over. And I should also move that transition that we put onto the list item onto the anchor tag as well. So now let's have a look at how we can do this using JavaScript. So for this first JavaScript example, you'll see that our CSS is back to how it was before I made all of those changes, because this is pure JavaScript. We don't need any additional CSS to make this work. In the index page, I've removed all of the anchor tags from around those icons, but I still have all of the IDs on the elements because we still need some way of picking out those elements in our JavaScript. Now, if I scroll down to the bottom of the HTML, I want to have another look at the JavaScript that we used last time to get the menu system to work. So we learned that using document.getElementById, we can pick out elements on the page and attach event listeners to them. In other words, we can make things clickable using JavaScript. So remember what this code here does. It finds the menu element on the page. That's the hamburger, remember. It adds a click to it, and whenever you click it, it finds the header element on the page and it either adds or removes the dropped class. So that is what allows this to function. So what we're going to do now is actually use exactly the same technique to make each of the icons in my navigation clickable. And when you click on each one, we'll use JavaScript to scroll down to the place in the page that we want it to go to. So first of all, I actually need each of these list items here to have its own ID, so that I can pick it out in JavaScript and attach a click event to it. Now what I can't do is just call this Steam, because that's the ID that I've put onto the main element here, and you can't reuse IDs. With a class, you can apply a class to as many elements as you like, but an ID must be unique. Only one element on the page should have it. So what I'm going to do up here is actually put Steam-button. So let me go ahead and do that for the other three as well. Brilliant. So now that I've got an ID on each of these list items, I can go down into my JavaScript and start attaching click events. So the code that we need looks like this. Document, which means look on the page, for an element with a particular ID, and in this case it's Steam button. And what I want to do is add an event listener, which is going to be a click event, And when that click happens, I want the following function to run. So in here is where I now need to put the code to scroll the page. So again, search the document for a specific element with an ID of Steam. Remember, that's the main tag. But this time we're not going to do add event listener because that wouldn't make any sense. I don't want that whole main element to be clickable. What I need to do is scroll into view. So that's the function that's actually going to scroll that element into view. It's a function, so it needs brackets, semicolon. Now let's refresh the page and see that working. So there you go. I've clicked on the list item and the page has scrolled up to the top. It's showing me the main element with the ID of Steam. But of course you noticed it was instant, similar to the problem we had with HTML and CSS. Now remember, we fixed that the first time around using CSS and the scroll behavior property. Well, we can actually control that using JavaScript as well. So what I'm going to do is go inside my scroll into view function, and I'm going to add in an option. Just let me expand my window a little bit so that the text doesn't wrap when I do this. And to add in my options, I need a set of braces first of all, and I'm going to type behavior smooth. Okay, let's refresh the page and try again. So now you can see that it smoothly scrolls to the top. So now let's go ahead and add those click events to the other 3 list items as well. Okay, so now you can see that the 4 list items all have click events on them, and each one is scrolling to a different element on the page. So let's refresh and test this. So I click on PlayStation, it scrolls to that part, Xbox to that part, mobile. But you might have noticed that we still have that same problem we had before. Because we have a header that is fixed and lifted off the page, the top of that element is actually hidden behind the header. Now, because we're using JavaScript, we actually have a few more options to play with to try and fix this. So the best way to do this is going to be to go inside the options that we've added to our scroll into view function, comma, I'm going to put in a second option, which is the block option, and the value I want is center. So now as the page scrolls, instead of the element being at the top of the viewport, that is actually going to center the element instead. So let me go ahead and drop that onto all 4 and then we'll test it. So let's refresh the page. And you can see now this section is centered within the viewport. Now it might be that you're perfectly happy with that, and in which case you could use this technique no problem. But what if you absolutely insist on making sure that when you scroll to a particular section, it scrolls to that point right there? Well, I've got one final JavaScript example to show you, which is going to be more complex than this, but also more efficient. And I'm going to show you how we can really fine-tune exactly where the top of the element finishes when we scroll. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, this final version of page scrolling with JavaScript is going to be more complex than the methods that I've already shown you. So hopefully it will all make sense. Now, for this one, I'm not going to be adding an ID attribute to the list items. Instead, in the JavaScript, I'm going to be kind of grabbing all of the list items at once. But I do need some way of identifying exactly which element on the page I should be scrolling to when each list item is clicked. So to do this, what I'm going to do is actually add in a data attribute to each of the list items. Now, a data attribute is basically a way of storing any value that you need on an element, usually so that you can do something with JavaScript. The way that you create a data attribute is to first type the word data, then a hyphen, and then you get to kind of name that data attribute. So the word that you type after the hyphen is entirely up to you. So what I'm going to store here is actually the ID of the element that the window needs to scroll to. So for the first one, it's just going to be Steam. For the second one, it's going to be PlayStation, etc. So let me go ahead and add those in. And there you go, you can see that I've added a data attribute to each of those list items, and like I said, I'll be using that information later on in the JavaScript. So let's scroll down to the script tag. I'm going to go after the code to do with the menu, And let's go ahead and grab all of those list items. So that looks like this. Document dot, and I'm not going to use get element by ID this time. Instead, I'm going to use query selector all. And inside the brackets, I'm going to put nav li. Now, if you're looking at this right now and you're thinking, that looks like CSS, then you'd be right. Nav li is the selector that you would use in CSS if you were trying to target all of the list items inside nav tags. And here what I'm doing is using a CSS selector to actually pick those list items out using JavaScript. So now I've got all of those list items, what I need to do is something for each of them. And what I need to do for each of them is run a function. And it's here that I can now add the event listeners, those click events, so that each of the list items becomes clickable. But I need some way of saying first list item dot add event listener click, second list item dot add event listener click, etc. Now the way that I can do that is by going inside the brackets of the function and dropping in a parameter, and this value is going to represent each of the list items, so I'm going to call it list item. So now inside the function, list item actually represents each of those list items in turn. So for each one, I want to add an event listener, which if you remember is going to be click. And when that list item is clicked, I need a function to run. And it's here that I can now scroll to the part of the page that I want to scroll to. So to do that, I'm going to use window.scrollTo. So this is a function that allows you to scroll the window to any point that you choose. Now inside the scrollTo function, I need to add in a few options. The first one is going to be topped. This is the most important one. So for the moment, I'm just going to put 0, but obviously that needs to change depending on which element I am scrolling to. Left, well, you can actually use scrollTo to scroll left and right as well, but I don't want to be scrolling horizontally, so that's going to stay on 0. And the final one should look familiar. This is how you can set the scrolling to be smooth. So at the moment, what we've actually got are 6 list items, and each one, when you click on it, is going to scroll nowhere. So although we've attached all of these click events, we need to do something to make that top value different for each list item. So what I'm going to do is go up above the window.scrollTo, and I'm now going to access that data attribute from each of the list items. And you'll see why in a minute. So that's going to look like this. Document.getElementById list item dot dataset. So that means go to the current list item, get all of the data attributes that are on it, even though we've only got one, and then pick out specifically, and remember, that is going to be either Steam or PlayStation or Xbox. So this now means document.getElementById Steam or getElementById PlayStation. This is now actually going to go down the page and pick out that element. And that is why we stored that value in the data attribute in the first place. Now there's no point just finding that information. I need to store that in something so that I can use it. So I'm going to create a variable, and this is going to be the top position that I can put inside that top value, although we haven't actually got that pixel value yet. But I've stored it in a variable because I want to do a little console log to check that it has worked. So let's go back over to our page. Bring up the console. And when I click on each of these list items, my JavaScript should grab the data attribute and then locate the element with that ID on the page. So let's see if it works. Okay, so there's the main tag with the ID of Steam. There's the section with the ID of PlayStation, Xbox, mobile. So those are working just fine. And if I click on the next one, it just says null. And that's because there is no data attribute on those list items. But remember, I don't want the whole element here. What I need to do is find out a pixel value that represents where the top of that element is from the top of the window. So to do that, I can use a property called offset top. So that is the pixel value that I need. Now I'm still outputting to the console, so let's go ahead and try this again and see what happens. Steam, of course, is at the top. The PlayStation section is at 589 pixels down the page. The Xbox section is at 1133 pixels down the page. So now I actually know the position of these elements on the page. So what I want to do, of course, is go into my code, and instead of putting 0 in there, I'm now going to pop in top position. So let's refresh the page and try it out. So now you can see that we actually have page scrolling working. But we still have that problem where the top of the element is hidden behind the header. To fix that, it is now incredibly simple. All I need to do is take that offset top value and subtract the height of the header. So now you can see that when I click on each of the list items, it scrolls to exactly the place that I want it to. Now there is one final thing that I'd like to do with this, because at the moment, if you're on the mobile view and you click one of these icons to scroll, we can see that the drop-down menu is still open, and that's fine. I mean, the user could just close it themselves, but normally what would happen when you click on an icon in a drop-down list, it would scroll to that part of the page and the drop-down list would close. And that's relatively easy to do. All we need to do is go into the code where we're creating our click event for each list item, and also make it remove the dropped class from the header. So we can just say document dot get element by ID header dot class list, just like we did when we were toggling, but this time instead of toggling, we're going to remove it. So let's refresh the page and test if that works. So I'm going to drop the menu, click on one of these icons to scroll the page, and you can see that the dropped class is also removed, and that just makes things a little bit neater. And that's it. I did warn you that that last example would be more complicated, but well done if you managed to follow along with me. Now don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and I'll see you in the next one.